From My Life with the Chimpanzees by Jane Goodall. Memoir. Background. Gombe Stream National Park in Tanzania, Africa, is best known as the site of Jane Goodall's groundbreaking chimpanzee research. The park covers only about 20 square miles, but is home to a great variety of animals. Dr. Goodall's research in Gombe was supported by the famous paleontologist Louis Leakey. In this account, Dr. Goodall occasionally refers to Dr. Leakey by his first name only. About the author. Dame Jane Goodall, born 1934, is the most celebrated primatologist, or researcher of primates, which includes apes, chimpanzees, and monkeys, of the 20th century. She spent extended periods living with and observing chimpanzees in the wild. Dr. Goodall did most of her research in Tanzania at the Gombe Stream Game Reserve, now a national park, where she lived from 1960 to 1975. In 1977, she co-founded the Jane Goodall Institute for Wildlife Research, Education, and Conservation. From My Life with the Chimpanzees by Jane Goodall. July 16, 1960, was a day I shall remember all my life. It was when I first set foot on the shingle and sand beach of Chimpanzee Land, that is, Gombe National Park. I was 26 years old. Mum and I were greeted by the 2 African Game Scouts who were responsible for protecting the 30 square miles of the park. They helped us to find a place where we could put up our old ex-army tent. We chose a lovely spot under some shady trees near the small, fast-flowing Kakombe stream. In Kigoma, before setting out, we had found a cook, Dominic. He put up his little tent some distance from ours and quite near the lake. When camp was ready, I set off to explore. It was already late afternoon, so I could not go far. There had been a grass fire not long before, so all the vegetation of the more open ridges and peaks had burned away. This made it quite easy to move around, except that the slopes above the valley were very steep in places, and I slipped several times on the loose, gravelly soil. I shall never forget the thrill of that first exploration. Soon after leaving camp, I met a troop of baboons. They were afraid of the strange, white-skinned creature, that was I, and gave their barking alarm call, "Wahoo! Wahoo!" again and again. I left them, hoping that they would become used to me soon. Otherwise, I thought, all the creatures of Gombe would be frightened. As I crossed a narrow ravine, crowded with low trees and bushes, I got very close to a beautiful red-gold bushbuck, a forest antelope, about the size of a long-legged goat. I knew it was female because she had no horns. When she scented me, she kept quite still for a moment and stared toward me with her big, dark eyes. Then, with a loud barking call, she turned and bounded away. When I got to one of the high ridges, I looked down into the valley. There, the forest was dark and thick. That was where I planned to go the next day to look for chimpanzees. When I got back to camp, it was dusk. Dominic had made a fire and was cooking our supper. That evening, and for the next 4 days, we had fresh food from Kigoma, but after that we ate out of cans. Louis had not managed to find very much money for our expedition, so our possessions were few and simple: a knife, fork, and spoon each, a couple of tin plates and tin mugs. But that was all we needed. After supper, Mum and I talked around our campfire, then snuggled into our 2 cots in the tent. Early the next morning, I set out to search for chimpanzees. I had been told by the British game ranger in charge of Gombe not to travel about the mountains by myself, except near camp. Otherwise, I had to take one of the game scouts with me. So I set off with Adolf. That first day, we saw 2 chimps feeding in a tall tree. As soon as they saw us, they leapt down and vanished. The next day, we saw no chimps at all, nor the day after, nor the day after that. A whole week went by before we found a very big tree full of tiny round red fruits that Adolf told me were called msalula. From the other side of the valley, we could watch chimps arriving at the tree, feeding, then climbing down and vanishing into the forest. I decided to camp in the best viewing site so that I could see them first thing in the morning. I spent 3 days in that valley, and I saw a lot of chimps. but they were too far away, and the foliage of the tree was too thick. It was disappointing and frustrating, and I didn't have much to tell Mum when I got back. There was another problem that I had to cope with. Adolf was very lazy. He was almost always late in the morning. I decided to try another man, Rashidi. He was far better and helped me a lot, showing me the trails through the forests and the best ways to move from one valley to the next. He had sharp eyes and spotted chimps from far away. But even after several months, the chimps had not become used to us. They ran off if we got anywhere near to them. I begged the game ranger to let me move about the forests by myself. I promised that I would always tell Rashidi in which direction I was going, so that he would know where to look for me if I failed to turn up in the evening. The game ranger finally gave in. At last, I could make friends with the chimpanzees in my own way. Every morning, I got up when I heard the alarm clock at 5:30 a.m. I ate a couple of slices of bread and had a cup of coffee from the thermos flask. Then I set off, climbing to where I thought the chimps might be. Most often, I went to the peak. I discovered that from this high place, I had a splendid view in all directions. I could see chimps moving in the trees, and I could hear if they called. At first, I watched from afar, through my binoculars, and never tried to get close. I knew that if I did, the chimps would run silently away. Gradually, I began to learn about the chimps' home and how they lived. I discovered that, most of the time, the chimps wandered about in small groups of 6 or less, not in a big troop like the baboons. Often a little group was made up of a mother with her children, or 2 or 3 adult males by themselves. Sometimes many groups joined together, especially when there was delicious ripe fruit on one big tree. When the chimps got together like that, they were very excited, made a lot of noise, and were easy to find. Eventually, I realized that the chimps I watched from the peak were all part of one group, a community. There were about 50 chimps belonging to this community. They made use of 3 of the valleys to the north of the Kakombe Valley, where our tent was, and 2 valleys to the south. These valleys have lovely sounding names: Kasakela, Linda, and Rutanga in the north, Makinke and Nyasanga in the south. From the peak, I noted which trees the chimps were feeding in, and then, when they had gone, I scrambled down and collected some of the leaves, flowers, or fruits so they could be identified later. I found that the chimps eat mostly fruits, but also a good many kinds of leaves, blossoms, seeds, and stems. Later, I would discover that they eat a variety of insects and sometimes hunt and kill prey animals to feed on meat. During those months of gradual discovery, the chimps very slowly began to realize that I was not so frightening after all. Even so, it was almost a year before I could approach to within 100 yards, and that is not really very close. The baboons got used to me much more quickly. Indeed, they became a nuisance around our camp by grabbing any food that we accidentally left lying on the table. I began to